So this is it. The American Dream. Or at least, the starter pack version they sell you in the brochures, complete with a picket fence that's probably not included in the final price. I'd finally done it. I'd traded my shoebox apartment in the city, with its charming symphony of sirens and the perpetual thumping from my upstairs neighbor's aspiring career as a professional clog dancer, for the supposed peace and quiet of Crestwood Meadows. I was sitting on a cardboard box labeled kitchen stuff, fragile-ish, in my new, mostly empty living room, surveying my kingdom. It wasn't much yet, just beige walls and an echo, but it was mine. A whole house, with a yard, a 2-car garage, and most importantly, it was a blank canvas for my magnum opus, the creation of the world's most unnecessarily advanced, fully automated smart home. As a freelance app developer, I had the time, the technical know-how, and a slightly worrying amount of disposable income to burn on gadgets that would allow me to control my toaster from another continent. The brochure promised tranquility. The brochure, I would soon learn, was a filthy liar. It had conveniently omitted the neighborhood's final boss, the gatekeeper of beige conformity, the woman who probably color codes her garbage, Brenda. My first inkling that suburbia wasn't all sunshine and neighborly barbecues came not in the form of a welcome basket, but a laminated note. It was taped to my front door with an aggressive amount of Scotch tape, as if to say, "This message is permanent and legally binding." It was a welcome note that was 90% a list of my transgressions committed within the first 24 hours of my arrival. My moving truck, apparently, had overstayed its welcome on the hallowed asphalt of Maple Lane. My empty pizza boxes, visible through the top of the recycling bin, were a visual blight. The note was signed with a flourish, "Brenda Jenkins, President, Crestwood Meadows HOA." Before I could even process this passive-aggressive welcome, the author herself materialized on my freshly mown, but apparently not to regulation height, lawn. Brenda was a woman in her late 50s, clad in a pastel pink tracksuit that screamed both leisure and imminent judgment. A clipboard was clutched in her hand like a scepter. "Welcome to Crestwood Meadows, mister," she chirped, her smile as thin and brittle as a sugar-free wafer. "Alex, just Alex," I said, trying to summon a charming, non-threatening smile. "And thanks. It's great to be here." "Yes, well," she continued, her eyes scanning my property with the intensity of a T-800 searching for Sarah Connor. "We like to maintain a certain standard in our community. I just wanted to give you a friendly reminder about our landscaping guidelines." She then produced a small metal ruler from a pocket in her tracksuit and knelt down. "Your lawn," she announced, after a moment of intense measurement, "is currently 1/4 of an inch above the regulated height." My brain short-circuited. Unruly? Lady, I've seen less regulated ecosystems on the Galapagos Islands. I was sure her 300-page rule book, which I later received via a passive-aggressive email attachment, was a document studied by legal scholars for its sheer, mind-numbing complexity. It dictated everything from the acceptable shades of white for window blinds, eggshell, antique lace, and Navajo white were acceptable. Simply white was a finable offense, to the prohibition of any wind chimes that produced dissonant tones. Who was the arbiter of tonal harmony? Brenda, of course. I spent the next few weeks in a state of amused annoyance. My smart home project began in earnest. My front porch turned into a graveyard of cardboard boxes from Amazon, Newegg, and a dozen other online retailers. Each new arrival was a fresh assault on Brenda's delicate sensibilities. She became my personal, unpaid, and deeply unwanted logistics manager. An email would arrive minutes after a delivery truck pulled away. "Dear Alex, I noticed you received a package from Tech Stuff Inc. I trust this isn't another one of those noisy gadgets you young people are so fond of. Lady, you have no idea. The crown jewel of my project was the kitchen. I'd ordered a state-of-the-art, professional-grade gas range and a matching smart oven. They were beautiful stainless steel beasts, capable of being preheated from my phone while I was stuck in traffic. The installation, however, required me to connect them to the main gas line. I mentioned this to my best friend Tom over a video call. "All right, so now for the fun part," I said, panning my phone's camera over to the gleaming new appliances. The gas line. "Alex, are you crazy?" Tom's pixelated face looked concerned. "You're going to mess with a pipe full of highly flammable, potentially explosive stuff? Dude, call a professional." "Nah, I've got this," I said with more confidence than I felt. "I've watched like 6 YouTube tutorials. The guy in the videos made it look super easy. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words. I know, but hey, I figured if things went south, at least it would be a spectacular story for my eulogy. The day the appliances were delivered, Brenda went into full meltdown mode. She marched up my driveway, her face the color of a ripe tomato, her clipboard held like a weapon. "This is a major installation, Alex!" she shrieked, her voice trembling with a rage that seemed wildly disproportionate to the situation. "You can't just bring in industrial equipment without consulting the board." "Industrial equipment? It's a stove, Brenda," I shot back, my patience finally evaporating. "For cooking. You know, that thing people do to make food? And for the last time, my project is all internal. It has nothing to do with you or your beige-loving cult." The word cult seemed to strike a nerve. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits of pure fury. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "You will regret this, young man. You will see. Some people just don't belong in Crestwood Meadows." I watched her stomp back to her house, a fortress of impeccable landscaping and simmering rage. I scoffed, dismissing her as a harmless, if completely unhinged, suburban cliché. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Later that evening, I was in my home office debugging a piece of code when I smelled it. A faint, cloyingly sweet odor. Gas. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me after the confrontation with Brenda, but the smell got stronger. I walked through the house, my heart starting to pound against my ribs. The kitchen seemed fine. I opened the back door, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. I followed it to the side of the house, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. And then I saw it. The copper gas line leading from the meter to my house, the very line I was planning to work on, was severed. It wasn't a crack or a leak. It was a clean, deliberate cut. My blood ran cold. The earlier humor of the situation, the amusing anecdotes I was already composing in my head about my crazy neighbor, all of it vanished, replaced by a primal fear. I looked up, my eyes drawn instinctively to Brenda's house, and there she was, a silhouette in her upstairs window, perfectly still, watching me. A new feeling began to bubble up through the fear. White-hot, incandescent anger. She had crossed a line. This wasn't about lawn height or noisy gadgets anymore. This was something else entirely. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. "Yeah, hi," I said to the operator, my voice a strange mix of panic and grim resolve. "I need to report a gas leak at 123 Maple Lane, and you might want to send the cops, too. I have a pretty good idea of who the leaker is. Let's just say my neighbor isn't a fan of my recent kitchen renovation, and she has a thing for gardening shears." The response was overwhelming. Within minutes, my quiet, sleepy suburban street looked like a staging area for a Michael Bay film. A fire truck, its lights painting the houses in frantic strokes of red and white, parked at an angle across the road. An ambulance idled by the curb. A van from the gas company screeched to a halt. But the main event, the true showstoppers, were the Hazmat guys. They spilled out of their truck like a team of sci-fi stormtroopers, clad in enormous, puffy white suits that made them look like sentient marshmallows. They moved with a calm, methodical purpose that was both terrifying and, I had to admit, a little bit cool. I stood on my porch, phone in hand, live tweeting the chaos. Okay, so things have escalated. My front lawn now looks like a landing zone for a remake of, quote, E.T., quote. There are men in giant hazmat suits walking around my petunias. Brenda is not going to be happy about the petunias. #HO warfare, #gaslight gatekeep gas leak. Right on cue, Brenda's front door flew open. She stormed out, a fluffy pink robe thrown hastily over her tracksuit, her face a mask of pure indignation. But she wasn't horrified by the potential for a neighborhood-leveling explosion. No. She was horrified by the yellow tape. A firefighter, who I mentally dubbed the fire chief, was in the process of cordoning off the area. The yellow tape, as fate would have it, stretched directly across Brenda's prize-winning rose bushes. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the professional calm of the first responders. "I am the president of this homeowners association. You are trampling my award-winning Queen Elizabeth roses. I demand you remove this unsightly yellow tape immediately." The fire chief, a man with a magnificent mustache and an expression that suggested he'd seen everything from cats stuck in trees to actual meteor strikes, turned to her with an air of profound weariness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a deadpan rumble. "There's a major gas leak. Your roses are the least of our concerns right now. Please go back inside your house." Brenda looked as if he had just suggested she set fire to her own hair, but her outrage was just getting started. Another member of the hazmat team, moving with purpose, began to run another line of tape, this one cordoning off Brenda's own house. She was now officially a prisoner in her own pastel palace. The sheer, unadulterated schadenfreude that washed over me was glorious. I was filming the entire exchange on my phone, providing a running commentary for Tom, who was on the other end of the line, howling with laughter. For the first time since finding the severed pipe, I felt a flicker of power. The chaos she had created had turned on her, trapping her in a web of her own making. Just as I was savoring the moment, a police car pulled up. Out stepped two officers. One was older, with tired eyes and a slump to his shoulders that spoke of decades of dealing with human stupidity. The other was young, barely out of the academy, with a crisp uniform and an eager, by-the-book expression. I mentally cast them as Miller and Davis, the classic cynical veteran and his bright-eyed rookie partner. They approached me, their expressions grim. I quickly pocketed my phone and rearranged my face to look like a responsible, concerned citizen. And not a man who was seconds away from creating a meme out of his neighbor's public meltdown. "Are you Alex Parker?" Officer Miller asked, his voice gravelly. "That's me," I said. "The guy with the unexpectedly airy backyard." Miller's lips twitched, but he remained professional. "Can you walk us through what happened?" I gave them my statement, carefully curating my words. I didn't want to sound like a hysterical nutjob. I laid out the timeline of my feud with Brenda, starting with the lawn measurements and escalating to the industrial equipment confrontation. I painted a picture of a woman obsessed with control, a petty tyrant whose grip on reality was, to put it mildly, slipping. "So," Officer Miller said, scribbling in his notepad, "you're saying you think your neighbor, Miss Brenda, what's her last name?" "Jenkins," I supplied. "Brenda Jenkins. But Voldemort has a certain ring to it, don't you think? She who must not be ignored. Miller sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of 1,000 stupid domestic disputes. You think Miss Jenkins cut your gas line because you didn't get an HOA permit for your new stove? I know it sounds crazy, I admitted. Believe me, I'm questioning my own sanity for even living here. But you haven't met Brenda. This is a woman who would fine you for breathing too loudly. For her, cutting a gas line is probably just the next logical step after a strongly worded email. The officers exchanged a look, then trudged across the lawn to Brenda's house. I retreated to my living room window, which now offered a perfect vantage point for the next act of this suburban drama. I felt like Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window, if his neighbors were less murderous husband and more deranged ruler of a tiny beige kingdom. Brenda's performance was worthy of an Oscar. As soon as she opened the door, the tears started. She was the frail, terrified old woman, a pillar of the community being harassed by the unstable young man who had just moved in. She clutched her chest, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that seemed to appear from nowhere, and spun a tale of woe that would make a soap opera writer blush. From my vantage point, I couldn't hear the words, but I could imagine them. She was probably telling them I was a menace, a threat to the neighborhood's delicate ecosystem of conformity. And then, the masterstroke. She gestured wildly in my direction, her voice rising. I could almost hear it. He's probably the one who cut it. For the insurance money. Young people are always running scams like that. Officer Davis, the rookie, was completely hooked. He nodded sympathetically, even patting her on the arm at one point. He kept glancing over at my house with a look of pure suspicion. I was now the prime suspect in the attempted bombing of my own property. Officer Miller, however, just looked bored. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression unchanging, as Brenda's one-woman show reached its crescendo. He'd seen this movie before, and he clearly wasn't impressed with the acting. But without any proof, their hands were tied. They left Brenda's house and gave me a non-committal, "We'll look into it," before leaving. The emergency crews eventually finished their work. The gas was shut off, the air was declared safe, and the yellow tape was removed. The circus left town, leaving behind only the trampled petunias and a simmering, unresolved tension. I was safe, but I was also furious. Brenda was going to get away with it. The next morning, I knew I couldn't live with a severed gas line forever. I needed a contractor. I found a highly rated local company online and made the call. A few hours later, a battered-looking pickup truck rumbled up my driveway, and out stepped a man who was the physical antithesis of Crestwood Meadows. He was a large, burly guy in his 40s, with a magnificent beard, grease-stained jeans, and a t-shirt that said, "I fix stuff." His name was Gus. Gus took one look at the severed pipe, let out a low whistle, and then scoffed. "Well, that ain't no accident," he grunted, poking at the clean cut with a thick finger. "See this? No burring. This was done with a pair of high-leverage cable cutters, nice and clean, not your average garden shears. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, or at least had the right tool for the job." A wave of validation washed over me. It wasn't just in my head. This was real. "That's what I told the cops," I said a little too eagerly. "They didn't seem to believe me." Gus chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. "Cops gotta have proof, kid. But I've been doing this for 20 years. I know a deliberate cut when I see one." He looked over at Brenda's house, then back at me, a knowing glint in his eye. "HOA trouble." "You have no idea," I sighed. Gus became my unlikely ally. We bonded over a shared disdain for petty tyrants and unnecessary rules. As he worked on replacing the damaged pipe, we talked. I gave him the whole sordid story, from the lawn ruler to the gas leak. He listened patiently, nodding in all the right places. "So this Brenda lady," Gus said, wiping his hands on a rag. "She a big gardener? Obsessed, I said. Her roses are her pride and joy. She probably sings them lullabies at night. Gus grunted. He stood up and walked over to the property line, his eyes scanning the ground near Brenda's immaculate rose bushes. I followed him, curious. See this? He said, pointing to a patch of disturbed soil right under one of the bushes. Someone was standing right here, recently. We both knelt down, our impromptu detective investigation officially underway. And then we saw it. Tucked just under the leaves of a Queen Elizabeth rose, almost invisible against the dark soil, was a single, pristine pink gardening glove. I recognized it instantly. They were Brenda's signature. I had seen her wearing them 100 times, a flash of pastel pink as she meticulously pruned, weeded, and terrorized her flora into submission. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was something. A piece of the puzzle. We had our first clue. The news of the great gas leak of Crestwood Meadows, as I dubbed it on my social media, spread like a virus. I was suddenly a local celebrity, or maybe an infamous villain, depending on which neighbor you asked. The neighborhood was divided into two camps, Team Alex and Team Brenda. The whispers at the community mailbox were deafening. "I heard he has wild parties," one of Brenda's loyalists would mutter. "Well, I heard Brenda once tried to fine the Hendersons for having unauthorized squirrels in their bird feeder," a sympathizer would retort. The squirrel comment piqued my interest. The Hendersons lived a few houses down. Mr. Henderson was a quiet, elderly man I'd only ever seen trimming his hedges with meticulous care. One evening, as I was dragging my, now HOA compliant, trash can to the curb, he shuffled over. "Mr. Parker," he said, his voice a frail whisper. "Alex, please." "Alex," he repeated with a small smile. "I heard what happened. I'm not surprised." He leaned in closer, as if sharing a state secret. "That woman. She's a menace. 20 years ago, she forced the Millers to repaint their house 3 times because she claimed the shade of beige they used was too aggressive. It gave her migraines," she said. "Too aggressive?" I repeated, dumbfounded. "How can beige be aggressive?" "With Brenda, anything is possible," Mr. Henderson said, his eyes twinkling with a long, suppressed amusement. "She's more cunning than she looks, son. Be careful." Mr. Henderson's stories were a revelation. He became my secret informant, a suburban deep throat providing me with a comprehensive history of Brenda's reign of terror. I learned about the infamous Wind Chime Inquisition of 09, the Great Mailbox Standardization Conflict of 14, and the time she tried to have a family's golden retriever designated a repetitive noise nuisance. I started a secret file on my computer, a digital dossier codenamed Operation Take Down the Tyrant. I was no longer just a guy trying to install a smart oven. I was a freedom fighter. I was leading a rebellion, and I was going to need a bigger plan. My garage became the official war room for the Crestwood Meadows resistance. It was me, Gus the contractor, who had become surprisingly invested in this feud, and my new secret weapon, Mr. Henderson. We were an unlikely trio, the tech nerd, the blue-collar muscle, and the geriatric spy master. We were gathered around a makeshift table, brainstorming. "We need to catch her in the act," I said, pacing back and forth. "But she's too smart to fall for something simple. She won't touch my property again, not after the gas line incident." "She's proud," Mr. Henderson added, tapping his finger on the table. "And she's obsessive. Her pride is in this neighborhood, in her rules. We need to attack that. We need something that will drive her absolutely, certifiably insane," Gus grunted, taking a long swig of his beer. "Something that's so offensive to her beige-loving soul that she can't just ignore it." And that's when it hit me. An idea so beautiful, so simple, so utterly, magnificently petty, it was perfect. I rushed to my laptop and pulled up the 300-page HOA rulebook, the digital tome of suburban suffering. I'd spent hours scouring it for loopholes, and I had found a glorious one. "Gentlemen," I announced, a triumphant grin spreading across my face, "I present to you Operation Flamingo Freedom." I explained the plan. The rulebook had excruciatingly detailed regulations on lawn ornaments. Gnomes had to be under 12 inches. Fountains required a specific pump noise level. But there was nothing, not a single word, about inflatable decorations. The bait was chosen. I went online and ordered the most obnoxious, most garish, most gloriously tacky thing I could find. A 10-foot-tall, solar-powered, light-up inflatable flamingo. It was a fluorescent pink beacon of bad taste, and it was going to be the centerpiece of my front lawn. The next day, Gus came over to help me set the trap. We installed a network of tiny, high-definition night vision security cameras. One was hidden in a birdhouse, another inside a fake sprinkler head, and a third was camouflaged in the knothole of the oak tree in my front yard. They were all wired to a live feed I could access on my phone. The following morning, we unveiled our masterpiece. The giant flamingo, which I had christened Floyd, stood proudly on my lawn, its long, spindly legs casting a ridiculous shadow over the perfectly manicured grass. It was a fluorescent pink middle finger to the entire aesthetic of Crestwood Meadows. The effect was instantaneous. I saw the curtain twitch in Brenda's window. A few minutes later, she was standing on her porch, staring at Floyd with a look of such profound horror and disgust, I thought she might actually have an aneurysm. My inbox was immediately flooded with emails from her. They started as formal warnings, citing non-existent bylaws about avian-themed temporary structures. I replied to each one with a polite message, complete with a screenshot of the relevant page from the HOA rulebook, highlighting the loophole. Her emails grew more frantic, more unhinged. The day wore on, and the tension built. The entire neighborhood was buzzing about the giant flamingo. Some people walked by and chuckled. Others, Brenda's disciples, scowled. That night, the war room was reconvened in my living room. Me, Gus, and Mr. Henderson were huddled around my laptop, watching the live feed from the cameras, a giant bowl of popcorn between us. It felt like we were watching the world's most boring yet most intense nature documentary. "She's gonna crack," Gus whispered, his eyes glued to the screen. "No way she can let that thing survive the night." "Patience, my friend," Mr. Henderson said calmly, sipping a glass of iced tea. "A true predator waits for the perfect moment to strike." And he was right. Just after midnight, we saw movement. A figure, dressed head to toe in black, crept out of Brenda's front door. She moved with a stealth that was frankly impressive for a woman in her late 50s. She was armed. In her hand, she clutched a pair of pruning shears. The three of us leaned closer to the screen, holding our breath. Brenda crept across her lawn, then onto mine. The night vision cameras captured her perfectly. She circled Floyd, her face a contorted mask of fury. She was muttering to herself. We couldn't hear the audio, but I imagined it was a litany of curses against me, my generation, and the entire concept of inflatable lawn decorations. Then she attacked. She lunged at the flamingo, stabbing it with her pruning shears. Pht! The first leg deflated. She stabbed it again and again. With each thrust, Floyd sank a little lower, his glowing pink form slowly collapsing into a sad, wrinkled heap on the grass. Finally, with one last, vicious jab to the neck, the great flamingo gave a final, long, pathetic sigh and died. Brenda stood over its carcass, panting, a look of triumphant madness in her eyes. "And we got her," I whispered, a slow, triumphant grin spreading across my face. I saved the footage, backed it up to the cloud, and then backed it up again to a separate hard drive. "That was beautiful, man," Gus said, shaking his head in awe. "Like watching a shark attack a seal. A big, pink, inflatable seal." Mr. Henderson raised his glass of iced tea. "To Floyd," he said solemnly. "He died a hero." The next morning I made my second 911 call in a week. This time my voice was calm, confident, and just a little bit smug. "Hello," I said to the operator. "I'd like to report an act of vandalism and trespassing. And good news, I have it all on video." Officers Miller and Davis arrived once more. Davis looked deeply annoyed, as if I was his own personal, recurring nightmare. Miller, however, looked intrigued. A flicker of amusement played on his lips. "Don't tell me," Davis sighed. "The neighbor lady looked at your house funny?" "Better," I said with a theatrical flair. "I'd like to invite you in for a movie." I led them into my living room and played the footage on my 65-inch television. The video was crystal clear. They watched in silence as Brenda, in glorious high definition, committed flamingocide. Her face, her weapon, her muttered curses that the high-sensitivity microphone in the birdhouse had picked up perfectly, an affront to God and the Architectural Review Committee. It was all there. Davis's jaw slowly dropped. His face went from annoyed to confused to utterly flabbergasted. Miller, on the other hand, just watched with a small, deeply satisfied smile. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this exact moment for a very, very long time. "Well," Miller said when the video ended, "I think that gives us what we need." Armed with the video, they easily obtained a search warrant for Brenda's house. I watched from my window as they went back over. This time, there were no tears from Brenda. There was only sputtering rage. And when they emerged from her garage, Officer Miller was holding a pair of high-leverage cable cutters in an evidence bag. The same kind Gus had described. In another bag was a single pink gardening glove. The other one was still sitting in my evidence locker. Brenda's arrest was the stuff of legends. It was a full-blown operatic meltdown. She screamed about her rights. She screamed about her roses. She accused the police of being part of my youthful, anarchic conspiracy. As they led her, in handcuffs, to the squad car, she shrieked, "This neighborhood will fall apart without me! It will descend into chaos and mismatched lawn furniture!" I stood on my porch, sipping a craft beer I'd been saving for a special occasion. As the squad car pulled away, I caught Officer Miller's eye. He gave me a slow, almost imperceptible nod. I nodded back. The reign of terror was officially over. The aftermath was blissful. A quiet revolution swept through Crestwood Meadows. It started small. The Hendersons put up a new bird feeder, a massive, squirrel-proof monstrosity. The family with the golden retriever let him bark to his heart's content. Someone painted their front door a vibrant, unapologetic shade of teal. It was beautiful. At the next emergency HOA meeting, the board was officially disbanded, and the 300-page rulebook was ceremoniously shredded. A new one-page document was drafted, its only rules being "don't be a jerk" and "no cutting your neighbor's gas line." Then, to my absolute horror, I was nominated to be the new HOA president. I tried to refuse, but Mr. Henderson gave me a look that said, "You started this. You finish it." I reluctantly accepted, vowing to be a benevolent leader and to immediately add a clause protecting the inalienable rights of all inflatable lawn ornaments. A few weeks later, my smart home was finally complete. Everything, from the blinds to the sprinklers to the ridiculously overpowered gas range, was connected and automated. To celebrate, I threw a massive Freedom Fiesta for the whole neighborhood. Gus, Mr. Henderson, and even an off-duty Officer Miller showed up. We barbecued, we drank, and we toasted to the memory of Floyd, the flamingo who had died for our sins. That night, I stood on my new smart patio, a beer in my hand, looking out at the neighborhood. It was no longer a sea of monotonous beige. It was a vibrant, eclectic, slightly weird community. I came here looking for peace and quiet, and instead, I found a war. But in fighting that war, I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for. I'd found a home. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a new project to plan. I'm thinking a giant 12-foot animatronic garden gnome, one that sings heavy metal and has laser eyes. The new HOA needs to be kept on its toes, after all.